Hello everyone, it's time to review the 3-card blind main event tournament results for March. Before we get started, I wanted to thank everybody in the community again for such an amazing turnout this month. We had a whopping 218 players this month, which is by far the most players we've ever seen before. Among those 218 players, there were 178 unique decks submitted. When we weigh those decks based off of their performance and evaluate them using the Simpsons Diversity Index, it becomes clear that this was the most diverse meta we've ever seen in this community. The 3-card blind diversity grade for this month is an A-. If you're curious about the 3-card blind diversity grade system, I'd recommend you watch February of 2024's Meta Snapshot, where I explain the logic behind this grading system. This level of diversity really shone through in the health of the meta this month. The most popular card this month was Ancient Tomb, which had an average score of 51% and a meta share of 14.19%. Seeing the most popular card of the month be a mana source that is close to 50% average score is really reassuring in terms of the health of the meta. The next most popular card was Inkmoth Nexus, which had an average score of 49% and a meta share of 8.17%. I do want to highlight Inkmoth Nexus here because its average score is a little deceiving. Inkmoth Nexus was used across 14 different decks that had massively varying average scores, ranging from 73% down to 25%. This means that the true power of Inkmoth Nexus is somewhat obscured in the stat that I presented saying that the average score was 49%, because there are very powerful decks that use Inkmoth Nexus as part of their game plan, but we had a lot of players cooking up unusual game plans that involved Inkmoth Nexus that affected its statistics in ways that might not be immediately apparent from just that 49% figure that I shared. The most popular deck played this month was Ancient Tomb, Leyline of the Guildpact, and Scion of Draco. The Scion of Draco deck had an average score of 56% and a meta share of 4.58%. I think there were multiple drivers for why this deck was so popular. For starters, it on paper looks like a very powerful deck, and then also because of this YouTube channel, I think a lot of newer players were acutely aware of this deck and saw it as a path to get a respectable number of wins under their belt. That being said, the performance of this deck varied dramatically across the different pods. In our higher ELO pods, Scion of Draco didn't manage to get higher than a 50% average score. On the other end of the spectrum, in our pods that contained only new players, the deck performed extremely well, claiming 70% average score or higher. I think this is a clear indicator that in a vacuum, this deck is extremely strong, but when players are playing around it and expect it to be there, it only performs just okay. Now, because we had so many players this month, we have a lot of pods and many winners to cover, so we're going to just jump straight into doing that. Let's start with Cruise Hawk, who was our winner in Group I. Cruise Hawk was playing Forest, Hexdrinker, and Mental Misstep. This was clearly a great meta call by Cruise Hawk, who managed to predict that there might be an abundance of 1-drops this month. I want to make a quick comparison here. Cruise Hawk had an average score of 75%, but in the same pod, we also had Uh-Oh, who was playing Forest, Hexdrinker, and Pick Your Poison, with a respectable, but significantly lower 55% average score. This means the difference between Cruise Hawk coming in the middle of the pack versus in the first place position in the pod was very much dependent on that meta call to include Mental Misstep. In Group H, our winner was Silas, who was playing Pardic Dragon, Sandstone Needle, and Wild Magic Surge. This deck turned out to be one of the more popular decks this month, and notably, this deck had a high prevalence in our high ELO group. I think it's fair to say that Silas is very much thinking like a high ELO player, and it's paying off. In Group G, our winner was Violet Avi, who was playing Deep Cavern Bat, Mishra's Factory, and Mox Jet. Over the past 3 months, more and more players have become aware of the fact that Deep Cavern Bat has a strong place in this format. Violet Avi has managed to capitalize on this card with the best performing Deep Cavern Bat deck to date. The deck claimed a whopping 79% average score thanks to its ability to disrupt the opponent's hand on turn 1, with a little bit of backup from Mishra's Factory in matches that get sticky. Our winner in Group F was Domelise, who was playing Chancellor of the Forge, Fury, and Mercadian Bazaar. This classic 3-card blind deck combines Chancellor of the Forge and Fury to either pressure life totals with the 1/1 Goblin while holding up Fury as a form of removal, or play a slower game with high-end payoffs where you can hard cast Fury or Chancellor of the Forge to put a bunch of stats and effective threats onto the board. In Group E, our winner was Quag, who was playing Dark Depths, Thespian Stage, and Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth. This is very much a if it isn't broke, you don't need to fix it sort of situation. Dark Depth has been a reasonably consistent performer in this format for a while now, and Quag by coincidence found themselves in a pod that wasn't running any sort of disruption for non-basic lands. In Group D, our winner was Contrived Kenku, who was very much also on a if it isn't broke, you don't need to fix it sort of game plan, running Energy Field, Sand Silos, and Ulamog the Infinite Gyre. This is another example of a deck that has performed extremely consistently in the format for a long time now, and beats most decks that don't come prepared with some way to deal with Energy Field. In Group C, we had a 3-way tie between Chico, Gornt, and Will Work for Sugar, who were all playing Bitter Blossom, Peat Bog, and Smallpox. Bitter Blossom is one of the strongest threats in the format right now that requires very little to support it, and Smallpox is a very disruptive card that hits most decks. In Group B, our winner was A.N. Jinner, who was playing Island, Seize Claim, and Sleep Cursed Fairy. This pod contained a plethora of juicy targets for Seize Claim, including Inkmoth Nexus, Storage Lands, Depletion Lands, and even Dark Depths. Bringing land disruption to the table here turned out to be an excellent choice. And finally, in Group A, our winner was Jamboree, who was playing Chancellor of the Forge, Foil, and Island. This is another example of a deck that has very consistently performed over this format's history, but frankly, I was quite surprised to see it come in first place in Group A. Foil is so good at disrupting decks that have only brought one threat to the table, or are relying on a card like a Mox to deploy their strategy, that it can often claim a huge number of free wins. However, this month it looks like very few players in Group A actively tried to beat the Foil deck, and that resulted in Jamboree claiming an easy win. This has also resulted in Jamboree claiming the #1 position on the lifetime leaderboard with an ELO of 1862, making Jamboree our new champion. Now that we've congratulated all of our winners, let's begin discussing the ban vote. As per usual, I will be providing you all with a short list of cards to vote on, whether you would like them to stay legal in the format or be added to the ban list. The goal behind the ban vote is to keep the format healthy and diverse by addressing overrepresented or oppressive strategies. However, because this is the most diverse meta we've ever seen, there really aren't as many slam dunk bans this time around. But I do want to make sure everyone in the community has the opportunity to push the format in the direction they'd like it to head in. For that reason, the first card to be included in the ban vote is Wild Magic Surge, which had an average score of 66% and a meta share of 3.26%. The air quotes drawback associated with Wild Magic Surge is not really relevant in 3-card blind because players generally speaking don't tend to have cards in their library at all. That means at a baseline, Wild Magic Surge is an instant speed sinkhole effect, and it also happens to be able to remove not just lands, but every permanent type in the game. My own personal opinion on where 3-card blind ought to be in relation to land destruction is that land destruction effects should be permitted, but there should be some sort of trade-off associated with choosing to run them. In the case of Wild Magic Surge, that trade-off simply is not there because it is effective against every strategy in the game. Next up on the list we have Bitter Blossom, which had an average score of 64% and a meta share of 4.52%. Bitter Blossom continues to be one of the most dominant threats in the format as a card that can scale into the late game, provides you with many blockers, highly evasive creatures, and because it itself is an enchantment, it's pretty resilient to most forms of removal. Next up on the list we have Scion of Draco, which had an average score of 56% and a meta share of 4.58%. And I will confess I have mixed feelings about including this card on the ban vote. On one side of the spectrum, Scion of Draco is very much a card that is all or nothing. If the deck gets disrupted, it has no backup plans whatsoever. This means that it isn't hard to come prepared to deal with Scion of Draco, but I think the large gap between the win rates of Scion of Draco decks that were in our pods that include experienced players versus our pods that included largely newer players indicated that the card is having a pretty significant impact on what people tend to play. And finally, unlike some other cards that we are talking about like Bitter Blossom, the Scion of Draco deck is really just one deck. Scion of Draco doesn't support any other interesting or creative strategies, it's only one deck that is able to leverage it. So I did want to include this card in the ban vote to provide players with the opportunity to express whether they'd like to continue to see Scion of Draco be part of the meta. On the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of how much of a scope a card has, we have Chancellor of the Forge, which is the next card that we're including in the ban vote. Chancellor of the Forge had an average score of 58%, and a meta share of 4.58%. Unlike Scion of Draco, Chancellor of the Forge supports many different strategies. However, the card has been around in this format for a long time and has always been performing extremely well. I think players have grown accustomed to this card's existence in the format and might not be aware of how much of an impact it is having on sculpting the meta. For that reason, I wanted to provide players with another opportunity to see what the format would look like without Chancellor of the Forge, at least for a short period of time. And finally, the last card included in the ban vote for this month is Dark Depths. Dark Depths had an average score of 62% and a meta share of 1.87%. Dark Depths has been another format staple for a long time now, and the impact that it has on the meta is not necessarily something that can be easily observed. It tends to be a card that's performance is massively impacted by how many players bring land disruption to the table. Cards that disrupt lands tend to be a recurring discussion when it comes to game health and balance in this format. And I think that Dark Depths might be playing a role in making that discussion harder to have. I think many players, including myself, want to see more decks that can rely on storage lands as part of their core strategy. That being said, for many players, non-basic land disruption has felt like a necessary evil to keep decks like Dark Depths in check. It could be interesting to see what kind of meta might evolve if Dark Depths were to exit the format temporarily so that storage lands and non-basic land disruption could hit an equilibrium without Dark Depths involved in the equation. So that wraps up our list of cards that we'll be voting on for the ban vote this month. And as a reminder, you can find the ban vote on the website under the Participate tab, or as a link in the description of this video. I wanted to thank you all again for another awesome month of 3-Card Blind. Thanks for watching everyone, and see you soon.